I am Caitlin Giles McCormick, the program coordinator at the Center for Nonprofits. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today for today's webinar, Utilizing Nonprofit Power for Anti-Racist Action. It's Tuesday, May 25th, and the one-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. So thank you for taking the time today and for your commitment to this issue. And we always have more to do, and this is one of those key ways that we continue those conversations and keep things going here. We've got Yvette Murry from YRM Consulting and Keith Timko from the Support Center that are going to be our presenters today. I do want to take a quick moment and actually talk a little bit about a companion webinar that we have to this one that is scheduled in just another week or so, June 2nd. From 3 to 4, there's a wonderful panel, and this is about continuing the discussion and about, as nonprofits, how can we utilize our own powers and our own access and our own resources to incorporate anti-racist action and change and diversity and inclusion in all of our work. So I would suggest signing up for that. Additionally, we have want to take a moment to talk about the Center for Nonprofits. We are the state's only association for the entire nonprofit community. We're here for you. We have 3 kind of major prongs of our organization: advocating for the entire nonprofit community, helping you build your capacity so you can do more with the resources you have, and providing members direct member services discounts, access to other services, connections to lawyers, things like that, whatever resources you may need. So we're here for you there. The Nonprofit Connect, we want to give a big shout out and thank you for them for helping to partner on this webinar today. Allison should be on as well, but they are a wonderful resource, particularly looking at boards and board training, and again, building your capacity as a nonprofit to do more work and work towards your mission there. So a huge thank you to them. Yvette Murry is here today. She's one of our presenters. She's with the YRM Consulting Group, and you can read a little bit about her there. I do want to take a quick moment and thank both Yvette and Keith. They are both former center board members and have been wonderful partners as we've continued their commitment, and we haven't let them go even though they're not board members anymore.
We want to know who's in the room, sort of what's your role, what is your intention for showing up today, and what's your superpower. So we're just going to take a minute or two just to do a check-in. This work is really hard, and what's important is that you are able to connect both with your own humanity but also with the humanity of those around you. Too often we jump into the work and don't acknowledge that I bring me to the work first. And by me bringing myself to the work, I need to know sort of, is this a good day for me to be in this place? Should I be doing something else? So if you could just put in the chat, I am not seeing. Keith, are you seeing the chat? Because I'm, for some reason, not able to see the chat.
We've got Allison's intention is to continue to grow in this journey and be an ally. Superpower is the ability to connect with others.
If you don't know how to use the chat function, it's at the very bottom, and we have expecting close to 100 people. So Edith and Allison, thank you.
Yes, there's 52 of us, so we'll we're managing this with the chat. We'll have some breakout rooms over the course of this.
There we go.
There we go.
Joyce's superpower is kindness, understanding my voice. It's a great one, Deborah.
I just want to jump in and say that if you bring your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, sometimes that toolbar disappears. If you bring your cursor down to the bottom, it'll pop up again, and that's where the controls are.
So I'm going to take it you don't like this question. Change agent. Oh, there we go. Trying to use my words and my language. Superpower is ability to listen. flexibility, empathy, see through my open eyes, ability to listen. The reason we pose this question is that this is a question that you really want to ask at the beginning of any meetings that are happening. You really want to check in and see where folks are. And we do this with, Keith and I do this work with nonprofits and foundations who are seeking to integrate diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging into the DNA of their organizations. So we are going to model for you what we believe is best practices. Another reason that you'll see that there are two of us here is that we want to make sure that voices have someone that they can hear from that looks like them, that may have shared experience. Very often when you find people are doing these workshops sort of as one, a one-person workshop, the challenge then becomes, okay, well, is there another voice? How does my voice show up if I don't have the lived experience or perceived lived experience with the person who happens to be there? Keith, thank you very much for those of you who participated. Keith, can we go to the next slide?
Sure. And also say, if you have to drop off now, like you should have already taken something away, right? Like in your meetings, are you creating space for people to talk about their intention and their superpower? I saw something about, disabilities inclusion, sort of like there's differently abled. So already just planting that seed of thinking about like, how are you creating those moments of inclusion and belonging in every meeting, not just a training with Yvette or myself, but in every one of the spaces that your organization is creating.
So this is just sort of highlighting that the work that we do really is to foster transformative organizations and individual growth, and that we're doing it together. And this is not a fast process. So if you have decided you want to do DEI, you want to integrate it into your organization, the thing to remember is that you're talking about 5 generations of work. You're probably not going to be able to finish it at the end of a meeting. And very often, one of the things that can happen is that we fall into white supremacist systems that say, no, you have to do it this way, check the boxes, and then you're done. It's a much slower process. And some days it feels like molasses, and other days you feel like you're just running downhill. But it's going to be that back and forth in that yin and yang. Caitlin already did that for me. You want to do yours, Keith?
Yeah, this is support center. You'll drop in the chat. You can see about our mission and our vision, what we do, then about me. And I think the thing worth noting is, like Yvette, like myself, is just figuring out how does our work look different now in light of the last year. So thinking about what that equity and inclusion lens looks like, and doing it in real time, not saying like, oh, we need some laborious strategic planning process to figure out that equity and inclusion are necessary. Of course they should get folded in, but like, what are some of the real-time changes that we can make in a much more organic way? So that's just a little bit of backstory. We'll share more information about YRM and Support Center, which leads us to our agenda.
You want to do the agenda, Keith, and I'll take from there.
Yeah, so we've got introductions and community agreements. We're going to talk a little bit about definition of concepts today. And I think of this as like, we're going to touch on a number of different things. This is, I think, perhaps designed to highlight what we don't know, also create some time and reflective space. I think some of the self-assessment of taking stock, both for ourselves as well as for our organizations. And then strategies for growth. And Yvette, I've borrowed, there's a lot of, what do you call it? It's like ear hustling, where you borrow phrases, quotes, other things. And so I ear hustle with Yvette, where she talks about growth edges, and people are like, what are growth edges? And you're like, well, growth edges are just acknowledging, hey, there's some things that I don't know, or some things. And so we're going to talk about what are those strategies for growth and those growth edges for us as individuals and as organizations.
So just some of the group agreements, if you are doing this work, we really encourage you to have some working agreements. Note that it doesn't say rules. It might be group guidelines, but you want to create language that's flexible, because this work is going to require you to be flexible. So we're going to spend some time today looking at our own humanity as part of our grounding. Some level setting of language, because very often in this work, people will use terms and assume that the other people in the room know what their definition is, and very often the definitions might not marry up. We're going to ask you to be respectful and to give grace both to yourself and to others. You will be in one, if not two, small groups. Discretion and confidentiality, that what goes on in a small group, it's fine to share the content of the small group, but none of us need to know who said what unless you want to share your own information. It's okay to speak in rough draft, that if we all wait until we say things perfectly, there will be silence from now until forever. So being able to also assume purity of motive, that people are not out to get you, and that you're not out to get someone else, that we're all speaking from our I position. This work really requires curiosity and discovery, that we, as I said, work with a number of organizations. And what we find is that if they're not curious about what does this work mean, how does race and racism and white supremacy and fragility, how does all of that sort of sit in the same space? And what do we do in order to be able to discover both about ourselves and about others? There's more than one way to see the world, to both create space and share space. So if you're someone who always jumps in, maybe sort of sitting back some and allowing for some times of silence, and to share the space, that we have a very large group and want to make sure that people are able to have their voices heard. Absolutely feel free to use the chat. There will be times we will open up the speaking aspect of of this workshop, and own your own experience. I mean, it's yours. Most of us learned about race at the knees of someone who raised us. And it's important to acknowledge that. You may not feel the same way, or you may feel very much the same way as the people who raised you. And then again, allowing time for silence. There will be times throughout the session that being quiet makes sense. And then to take a technology break, that we really hope that the only thing that you are engaging right now is whatever screen you're using to watch this presentation, because this work requires focus. And if you're answering emails and on the phone and doing everything else, then that tells you sort of where this might fit. And very often we'll say, oh, but these other things were important. And it's like, okay, but how do you develop your own hierarchy? The next one, Keith.
Yeah, and again, this is the other thing.
I'm sorry.
No, just if you don't currently use working agreements like this in meetings, we would strongly encourage you to do so. And that means your board meetings, your staff meetings. Like, it seems like a subtle thing, but just letting folks know you have permission to take a technology break. You don't have to be multitasking. We need you to be present. We're going to speak in rough draft. We may make mistakes, but like we want to offer that opportunity for dialogue. So it's a subtle thing. I remember when I first encountered working agreements years ago, I was like, huh, like, and then you just realize this is one of the single most effective tools, is just to level set, you know, and to bring people in. You can feel as though you belong when it's laid out of like, we're looking for you to come and join this community, actively participate. All right, next up.
So they're going to do two things. Today happens to be the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. George Floyd is to the far left of your screen, and there are a number of people who've lost their lives that are sort of embodied inside of his body. The top right picture is Emmett Till. For those of you who may not know, Emmett Till was a teenager and supposedly whistled at a white woman, which actually did not happen. And to the right of the picture is what his mother chose to show in his casket so that people understood what had happened to him. And then on the bottom is Breonna Taylor. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a 9-minute and 29-second moment of reflection. In that time, sort of what has happened for you in this last year. If you have names of people that you want to actually call into the space, you can feel free to open up your mic, or you can put the names in the chat. This could be triggering for folks. So the other thing I want to say to you is that if you need to go off screen, take care of yourself. It's been a really challenging year for us. So with that said, again, feel free to open your mic if you have a name that you want to call someone that is important to you and may have lost their lives this year, either through the pandemic or through other through violence, and or just sit in the space. So we're going to start our 9 minutes and 29 seconds.
I'd like to, I'd like to call out the name of Dante Wright.
Thank you. So before we sort of process some of that, what I'd like you to do, if you're able, and again, you don't have to turn your camera on, is cross your hands neither on your chest or on your shoulders. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to take a really deep breath. And then breathe out. Take a deep cleansing breath in, and then blow it out through your mouth. Keep taking deep breaths in and out. And as you pat, know that you are safe, you are cared for, you are loved, and being here is your superpower. Take 2 more breaths and come on back to the room. How are folks doing? You can use the chat, you can open your mic. How are folks doing?
That was a very long time.
What happened for you, either in your head, your heart, or your gut during that time? And this is for anyone. See, hurt, very powerful to experience the length of time. Emotions are flowing, angry, but trying to stay in that space. Other folks, how was that for you?
Done this before, and every time I do it, it's just remarkable that nobody thought to say, remove your knee from his neck, he's dying. And that's just what comes back to me. How could people have stood around? I know energy and emotion was flowing, but how could people have stood around and watch someone place their knee on someone's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds? It's a long time.
You know, as you talk about it, Rosie, and that's part of the work that a lot of times in our sector, we see things and we don't necessarily say things or do things. And it's important for us to see it, say it, and do something. Other folks, how are you feeling? Conscious of not having white women's tears, reflecting on the many years of injustice, discouraging, unbelievable. How do you think this is showing up with the people that you work with in your organization? Is everyone sort of in the same space? How are you addressing this in your organization today? Is this an issue only for brown people? Keith, can I have the next slide, please? That was a lot. It was a lot. And Keith and I sort of went back and forth about, do we do it? How long do we do it? And this is the work. The work is taking it slow. The work is being inside our bodies and understanding that all bodies are not valued in the same way. So when we think about our organizations, who leads? Whose voices are louder? When you think about your board, who's running your board? Are those voices that are reflective of the communities you serve? If they are reflective of people's financial ability to pay or play, could that be problematic? Does everyone have the same ability to pay or play? Do we share? Because one of the things that's really important about this, it's not about giving up, it's about gaining greater. That you don't have to give anything up. It's how do we make the circle broader? So when we, Keith, we're on the nonprofits slide. I can't see this.
Yeah, it's the all humans need to be seen
Okay.
and valued.
You want to take that one in the nonprofit one?
Yeah, and this is some of the reflection. I think I saw it in the chat. What was it? I'll just lift that up. Was it? It seems so basic, yet it astonishes and confounds how many folks truly don't understand the basic humanity of others. And this is also when we talk about boards, when we talk about who should influence the work of our organizations. Like, it's sort of astonishing that we don't naturally think that the people we're serving or sort of the key constituencies should be able to influence the work of our organizations, the direction. And in, you know, I presume like Linda, Debbie, others with the Center for Nonprofits, others could, you know, sort of reveal a history of how we got to this place, like through governance structures, through legal structures. But like some of this does become a notion of like fundamentally recognizing all humans need to be considered, seen, valued, included. And where do we like make these arbitrary distinctions of who can serve on a board? You know, and we say, oh, you have to be able to write a large check, or you wouldn't understand governance here. It's complicated. Is it? Is it really so complicated that these various community members, so looking for that as an opportunity, not just formally with governance as well. Like, I just want to encourage and challenge all of us to sort of create open lines of communication and dialogue with the communities where we reside, with the people we serve. Like, how can we co-create? How can we share the power around our organizations? And looking for that. And it's not, this is not a checklist exercise, but I think what we're trying to do is to prompt everyone to sort of have those moments of like, am I seeing the humanity in the community where I work, among those that I serve, where they're not clients, they're not recipients, but there are partners. You know, and some of this is just driven by justice. Like, it's not this notion of like noblesse oblige, which is the kind of fancy way of saying like, oh, like I have privilege, I have resources, let me share that. You know, like I think some of this we've really got to unpack, you know, what do all humans need to be seen, valued, successful? And what role do we as organizations, and then also modeling that within our structures, within our hiring practices, within our communications. And there's like a bunch of conversations that we could have from this. We could talk about our galas and our fundraising events where we spotlight, you know, like, oh, look at this family that we helped, you know, as opposed to maybe like reframing that of like, look at the systemic barriers that exist. Here's what we're able to mitigate that. But I don't know if Phil is on the line. I like their shorthand for addressing systemic racism is shorten the line. Like, we provide food for those who are food insecure, but like, let's get real. What we are trying to do is to shorten the line. We have fundamentally have to address systemic racism so that we don't have lines that are this long. So we don't have those needs. Which leads us to the sort of the nonprofit mandate, which is I think where where we're all going. And I'm very grateful for the Center for Nonprofits of bringing us together today. But we are entrusted to advance the public good. We are dedicated to ethical and progressive stewardship. But then we're committed to preserve equity and social justice. And that's, for all of us. And so if you as an organization aren't thinking about, well, how does systemic racism impact our work? And how can we engage with the Center for Nonprofits or other advocacy organizations to talk about, like, what are some of the policies? Like, if you read How to Become an Anti-Racist, it's not that there's bad people, but there are bad policies. There are lots of books that we could read, like The Color of Law, that reveal all of the policies that have created an unlevel playing field in this country. So I believe that there's a mandate, and Yvette does as well. That's why we work together, where we need to be dedicated to that, to preserving equity and social justice in all affairs. And that's at a high level, but we should be looking for, like, what does that concretely mean for us? How are we accountable as organizations? What are we doing? And so that's when there's, advocacy alerts from the Center for Nonprofits. That means you don't ignore them. That means when there's opportunities to connect with your elected officials, when there's opportunities to connect with funders, with other organizations to talk about movement building, we don't ignore those calls. Like, that's what we do together to preserve equity and ensure social justice. So there's lots more that we can learn about. I think it's just encouraging all of us to understand that there's a very, very clear relationship between equity and social justice in our work. And if we're just counting widgets, if we're just counting outputs, looking for that next grant to be able to do so, and neglecting the bigger picture, we do a disservice to ourselves, to our communities. We miss out on that opportunity. And it's going to take a while, but that's part of what brings us together here today. I see some things in the chat. Hopefully those are reinforcing points, about this. And look, maybe we're preaching to the choir today. Like, maybe you get that, but I think Yvette and I also come to you today as, we're not there yet. We're still, trying to make that time, looking for those opportunities, evolving as organizations, as people, but also recognizing that policy work. And for a long time, I sort of feel like we've all been like, oh, Center for Nonprofits, good luck with that advocacy agenda. We'll do, I don't want to paint with the broadest brush imaginable, but I do think this is that moment when we need to be in this work together. All right, so that brings us to do a little polling here. That you want to introduce this?
Sure. So there are lots of reasons that organizations, and I love the statement that someone wrote up here. It doesn't begin and end with DEI programming that nonprofits are throwing together in 2021 because they think they have to for funding. So the question is, why even do this work? And for some, it is the right thing to do, and it's already embedded into your HR and how you see your community and what that looks like. For others, it's economic leverage. Most funders are now saying, well, tell us what your DEI plan is. I encourage you, when you're looking at funders, to find out what's their DEI plan look like. And we really are beyond DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. We really are looking at belonging. How do people feel fully present and able to speak their life experience into our spaces? And we know that by having diverse voices, if you actually increase your innovation, the decision-making is enhanced, but you also have to ask yourself, who's positioned where? The comment that someone wrote about not having white women's tears. I happen to be a woman of color, and very frequently I'll be in rooms where white women will start to cry because their children don't have to deal with these things, or, oh, it's so horrible. And as a woman of color, it's like, okay, that's your work to do, but you need to do it away from me because I'm not allowed to cry. I'm not allowed to acknowledge my fear when my child leaves their home. So really understanding when those tears show up, is it about others taking care of you and you sort of taking the air out of the room? Or is it a way of solidarity, and this is what I'm going to do, because tears alone are not helpful. In Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, she does an entire chapter on white women's tears. We know that having diversity increases your productivity. enhances creativity. And one thing it's really important is that millennials and Gen Z, when we start thinking about HR and hiring, they will actually take a job at a lower income that aligns with their values than a job that's making a whole lot of money that is not aligned with their values. So when you think about your recruitment, where are you recruiting? Are you recruiting in the same old places and saying, we can't find anyone like this? Or are you broadening where you recruit? Are you reaching out to predominant organizations of Latinx people or API communities that you're seeking to serve? One of the organizations we're working with now they actually are now doing outreach at historical Black colleges, because a lot of people who go to historical Black colleges live all over the country. Just because you go to school, down south doesn't mean that's where you stay. And then for some, it's about checking the box, and that's that sort of idea that I don't necessarily need to be transformative. I want to be performative. It's equitable, and it also adds new voices. So Keith, you want to throw the poll up?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, so we're asking you to select your top 2 reasons for doing this. And so that this here, our shorthand, this is a rough draft. Someone asked, what's rough draft? Rough draft is imprecise language that if you gave me 10 minutes, I'd be able to refine this. But if you're doing work around diversity, if you're doing work around inclusion, equity, belonging, that's what the it is. And there's reasons why we do it. And this is anonymous. So you have permission to say, our organization is doing it, in my opinion, because it checks a box.
Mm-hmm.
We also believe in high levels of voter participation rates. And so we're at
Yes.
19 out of 50. So that's 38%. Like we should all be exercising rights to vote. So we're going to hang in there until we're satisfied. So we're climbing. We're at 32 out of 50. Very excited. We also use this as a straw poll of engagement in these webinars, believing if you've answered the poll, maybe you're there with us, not multitasking. Look at that, we're 88%. I feel like this is almost that moment, Yvette, where we can just hang in there. All right. Well,
And these are questions that, if you are taking on or engaged in an equity project within your organization, these are questions that need to be answered. And it's not about right or wrong, but you need to know from a level setting position where people happen to be. So it looks like advancing equity and the right thing to do came out as our 29, and actually they're both 29%. So again, these are the kinds of things you want to do when you are pulling groups together. And you need to also ask yourself, who are we pulling together to be part of our DEI committee? I'm a firm believer that if you're doing this work and the goal is to maintain a DEI committee, you probably missed the boat. This work should be embedded in every aspect of your organization. There shouldn't be anything in your organization where people just don't think about, okay, well, where does equity, fall here? What does it look like? One of the things I thought was really interesting when we look at equity around gender is, this notion of pregnancy as a disability. I mean, that's policy. And the notion that if you're pregnant and you go out on maternity leave, well, you have a disability, which means that there's something that is not like the other. And then you have people and organizations that have said, no, pregnancy is not a disability. And they make sure that people's salaries are made whole. That's policy. And that directly impacts your staff and how your staff is able to see themselves within the organization. I'll take the next one, Keith.
Okay. I'll also say I just caught up on the chat where it only let you select one. Like another important point of this work is allowing for multiple truths. So we modeled you choose only one reason. you know, and there's multiple reasons for doing this, which we deprive this group of that ability to kind of suggest that there's multiple reasons, you know, but sometimes about like making the case and understanding it's not just like a one size fits all. But there is some notion that this work will mean different things to different people, and that's okay. But I think the rationale behind it sort of shapes where do we place our priorities. Like to Yvette's point, I think when we start out, you can't do everything at once. You know, and this is a long-term proposition. So just wanting to like really reinforce the why is so, so important. You know, like I know Allison's been a part of these conversations around diversifying boards, you know, and the single worst place to be is looking to increase board diversity without clarity around why. Like, why do I care about these perspectives? Why do they relate? And it's multiple different kinds. It's not just racial diversity, but it's age, ability, lots of different dimensions. I'll go to the next one and stop talking.
And the other part, I think, is we can skip that one. And I think the other piece is to not just ask what's in it for us, but what's in it for the other person. You know, for those who know me, I've shared on numerous occasions that I have been invited to boards and have left. And I've left because of not belonging and finding out that I wasn't given the information of how the board works and who's a member of the board and what the different roles are. And then to find out that board members were talking about me to figure out how to deal with the little brown girl. You know, it was good to invite me, but, and was directly told, you need to kind of wait. You know, we'll let you know. Which, again, anyone who knows me knows that wasn't going to happen. I will say the best board I've ever been on is the Center for Nonprofit Board. I will say that over and over and over again. They have made it that I will never be on another board again, probably because I've just been so, you know, taken care of. So when we think about this work, we do need to be mindful of change models. How does change happen in your organization? With COVID overnight, we all changed. You know, many of us started working from home. Many of us all of a sudden had to learn all this new technology. So understand where change is, and also how much change can people sort of stand at the same time they're doing the work. So some of the organizations we work with, they actually do provide staff with time just to read, you know, to read the literature, they have, some organizations have affinity spaces for people to come together and to talk about sort of what they're feeling or what they've seen. And those affinity spaces may be mixed, they may be by racial identification. You have to know sort of what worked within your own setting. And that not all people of color who work at the organization. One of my colleagues recently said that his daughter happened to go to a predominantly white institution. And she said, I'm really tired of being the Rosetta Stone for all the white people. Really tired of it. It is not the job of people of color to wet nurse white folks. The work is about doing your work first and demonstrating that you really are in it to make a change and not just, again, to check the box. Next one, Keith.
Yeah, that one, yeah, it just made me think of like when we talked about inclusion, you know, and like just have we ever spent that time just asking someone, you know, like a recipient of our programs or kind of a partner in the programs, just about their experience or about who they are. You know, so sometimes I feel like we get hung up on the formal mechanisms of our board, like what's our board diversity look like, or what's our staff diversity look like, and maybe just sort of backing it all the way up, just a dialogue, you know, and open lines of communication, and just sort of, you know, creating that opportunity. So just, and some of it relates back to Yvette's point about time and making that time available for that and seeing it as an important and valuable use of time. Like some of us opened with our superpower is empathy. Like nothing supercharges empathy like active listening and being able to relate to someone else's experiences. But if we don't allow ourselves that time to have those conversations, to read about what's going on, to connect, you know, then we lose sight of, I think we deprive that empathetic superpower of ours. So move on.
Yeah, and I just wanted to lift up Heather's statement that DEI committees need white folks on them. You know, Keith and I talk about this a lot, that from the moment I wake up, I have a 100-pound backpack on, and I have to wear it all day long. And very often I'm invited all the time to be, on this committee and that committee. And I sort of go, why is it only the brown people that, I'm already overwhelmed. And now all of a sudden it's like, we need brown voices. And it's like, okay, you don't know any other brown voices. That's the thing. You probably have to do some investigation of why it's the same folks that are being invited all the time. And also needing rest. I mean, you need to know when you're, and this is particularly for folks of color, you need to know when you need to check out. And as an organization, is there space for that? So, because when Keith leaves, well, actually probably not Keith, but for some of us when we're on committees, when we leave, it's like, okay, we're good. I'm going off to live the rest of my life. I leave a committee, I'm taking all this stuff with me, which is part of that knapsack that I carry on my back. So when we think about, if you needed a definition for racism, we're talking about prejudice and power. Without power, this doesn't work. Just being prejudiced is not enough. So again, being able to do a real assessment of the organization and understanding it might be painful to really look at yourself and decide, gee, we might not be hitting the right tone or right note right now. Next one, Keith. This is the big job for all of us, that we all have been raised in systems and all of our organizations are uniquely designed to get the results they get. So we need to ask ourselves, what tools are necessary? And we have to create our own tools, or we need to rethink how we use the tools that exist for us to impact the world, to impact both the microcosm of and I mean microcosm of your family. Charity starts at home. This work also starts at home. Is this part of your daily conversation, or is it something you only have, periodically or sporadically? Want to do the next one?
This one might be just a fun moment, just if
Okay.
you have like other kind of like quotes or, I don't know, kind of guiding principles. Like here, I mean, we do this work. Just wanted to create just an opportunity to share out. You could unmute yourselves or drop it in the chat.
And these types of sayings can be helpful, again, around grounding. So it may be something that shows up in your board meeting. It may be something that shows up on your walls so that people remember.
Yeah, so we got James Baldwin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, and Sandy's doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yep.
And I do love someone I feel like someone was like, we borrow, every quote that we see has been stolen from somewhere else, right? I mean, so some of it's not about attribution, like the one that I use a lot in that, like there's an Arthur Ashe adage about start where you are, use what you've got, do what you can, which for me helps with just the feeling of overwhelm of like how do I connect the dots between like the daily, I was trying to figure out if there's like an opposite of a microaggression. Is it a micro affirmation or something, that you engage in, and how do you connect that with the broader wholesale change that we're seeking in the world? But yes, I'll go to the next one. But yeah, feel free to share with others, like what are the things, like the words that inspire you?
Now the first piece we're going to show you was from a year ago. With Senator Tim Scott, who happens to be a Republican senator. And the second clip was the Republican response to Joe Biden's presentation to Congress. So Keith, could you share those, please?
Senator Tim Scott, welcome to the Daily Social Distancing Show.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
The sound?
Thank you so much for being here, especially on today. We saw the President of the United States come out and release what many people were surprised to see from him, a sweeping reform, in his opinion, on police force. Some people felt like it didn't go too far. For President Trump, some people were shocked that he even did anything at all. You were in the room. You've been part of those discussions. What did you make of today's executive order?
I thought it was a good day. I thought it was a strong day for the country. I'm glad the president was willing to take up the issue that so many of us have been talking about all of our lives. And frankly, I started this journey 5 years ago in earnest, working on the Walter Scott Notification Act. And to be here now with the president signing an executive order that deals with some of the more important issues, from the tactics like the chokehold to the importance of co-responders, those folks who have mental health issues or addiction issues. This president has done something that almost all the folks on the other side said he would never do. And he found a path forward. And I will say thanks to the president for listening on this important issue.
What I've been really intrigued by, especially in your journey, is something that you've alluded to in your tweets, in that, you know, this is an issue that affects all Black people. You've shared your personal experiences, being pulled over by the police 7 times in 1 year. You've shared how that affects you as a human being and how reforms need to be made.
Yes.
What do you think politicians on both sides of the aisle are missing in how they address these issues for Black people in America?
You know, honestly, that's a great question, Trevor. From my perspective, we are missing the, if you're talking about the institutions of authority and the power to kill you, for us to not take this issue seriously, not as politicians, but as Americans. There's a reason why the institutions of authority are losing credibility in communities of color, is because they keep shouting about the same things and nothing changes. That is dehumanizing. It lowers all your expectations from society, and it leads to a level of frustration and irritation that is really hard to handle. And so when you see these situations unfolding so many times, and you finally get to the point, what in the heavens will cause a change? And frankly, had it not been for a video camera, I don't think most people would have believed that that officer had his knee on the neck for 8.5 minutes. Had it not been for a video camera, they would not have believed Walter Scott was shot in the back 5 times without a weapon. Had it not been the ability to record these issues, people would not believe us even to this day. And that's why, I apologize for getting so excited about this issue, but this is something we've been working on forever, it feels like. I did a Driving While Black event when I was on county council 20 plus years ago.
Wow.
And to think of the number of people who've had to have their car surrounded because they were simply going to see their grandparents, like I was. And to know that there are men and women in this country who feel like they are less than human, or that they're less valuable than someone else just because of the color of their skin. So whether you love President Trump or hate President Trump, I don't care. If you love Americans, we should be thankful that we're having this conversation and making some progress in the right direction on an issue that has plagued the African American community in the same fashion that the COVID-19 is plaguing the world. It's that serious.
One thing I didn't appreciate personally was how people were tweeting at you. You know, when it was announced that you were going to be leading the Republican effort, people said, oh, of course, the token Black guy, the one Black guy, the token. And it implied in many ways that you were only getting this position, you know, because it was saving face, as opposed to the fact that you've been the person who's been pushing for this arguably the most in the Republican Party. Is there a way that you've managed to convince some of your colleagues to say, hey, I know that you believe that you're a law and order person, but the people who are meant to be upholding law and order are themselves breaking the law and have no order? How do you convey that message to some of your colleagues?
Well, this I know law and order has so many definitions, but if you really believe in the law and order concept, the people who believe in it most is the African American community. Frankly, what we want are laws that apply equally in this nation to every single one of us. I want to say to the kids that are coming up now, we see you. You're not invisible. I want them to understand that this country stands for them. And if I have to take the crap from people who want to call me a token because I'm the guy that had the actual experience, I'm the one that went to the leader of the Senate and said, put me in charge, because I'm the guy that understands both how to respect the communities of color and how to cooperate and work with the law enforcement community so that there's not a binary choice. This does not work to our advantage if there's a binary choice. We actually don't need a binary choice. We need one choice. That's a lady of justice, blindfolded. That's what we need. That's what we want. And that's what everyone deserves.
Okay, now we're going to show you a video from I guess about 6 weeks ago, 4 to 6 weeks ago.
Taught that the color of their skin defines them again. And if they look a certain way, they're an oppressor. From colleges to corporations, to our culture, people are making money and gaining power by pretending we haven't made any progress at all, by doubling down on the divisions we've worked so hard to heal. You know this stuff is wrong. Hear me clearly. America is not a racist country.
Okay, you can stop.
It's backwards to fight discrimination.
Okay. So this all happened within a year that he sort of talked about his life experience, and I'm hoping you heard the messages about why he was chosen. What is the backlash that comes when you ask one person to do it? So the question didn't become, why is the Republican Party not more diverse? It was, we have one of those and we're going to send it, and this is the person that can do this work. The work cannot just be done by people of color. It has to be done in concert with each other. Next slide, Keith. I do encourage, when you're doing this work, to take breaks. I mean, don't just sort of try to power through it. So why do you think that, and I want to be clear, very often people will talk about courageous conversations. Courageous is relevant to who you are. When I have these conversations, I'm never being courageous, because I have these conversations all the time. So these are the kinds of questions you want to ask in your organization of, what makes it difficult? Because if you can't have the conversation about what makes it difficult, then how can you have the conversation of how we're going to affect change? Next one, Keith. These are 3 questions that we really encourage you to ask yourselves, and also, again, within your organization. That idea of how do you show up? Again, having been at lots of events, that notion of, we're going to show this family we did all these things for, and we don't look upstream. Why are people in the circumstances that they're in? How do you currently navigate conversations around white supremacy and systematic racism? I find frequently when the language is, we're going to discuss white supremacy, people will say, hey, you're calling me a white supremacist. I'm talking about a system. And it's a system that's designed for some to thrive and for some to be put into a secondary category. If you are white, by birth, you are given power just by being born. You don't have to do anything else. It is your inherent right. And then what are you willing to do to dismantle systems of oppression and racism? Next one. This gives you a model of just sort of what it means to move toward becoming an anti-racist. Being a non-racist is, I think that policies that discriminate aren't any good. Being an anti-racist is, I am actively going to seek to dismantle systems that oppress other people. As a Black female, I have experienced, and many of you have experienced the same, where you might be in a meeting and say something and people are like, oh. And then all of a sudden a white male says the exact same thing. It's like, oh, that's the best idea we've ever heard. So that's that notion of a microaggression, but as a person of color, that's a macroaggression. It is very clear where I stand in relationship to other people. The next one, Keith.
Yeah, and this is one, let me just pause for a second, just to,
Yep.
where I think we honestly have to take a look at our work and our organizations and reconcile or square it with, like, is there not kind of systemic racism, or this is rough draft as well. Like, there is some relationship between systemic racism and the economic inequality that our organizations are facing. And so I think a lot of organizations are like, well, should we be anti-racist? Like, what is that? We believe in diversity and inclusion, but this anti-racist language, it sounds stronger, like more forceful, more pointed. more radical, call it what you will, right? But I think we've got to just square the fact that systemic racism, like the disparities. What is it in New Jersey? It's like a white family has $350,000 of wealth, and then a Black family or Latinx family, it's like 5,000 or 7,000. Like if that's not playing out in the work of our organizations, then we've got to become anti-racist, and we've got to do that work, and it doesn't mean that we can do that work overnight, but I think using frameworks like this and connecting this idea of the fear zone versus the learning zone versus the, becoming an anti-racist organization. So really just want to encourage everyone to, to think about whether or not you and your organization need to be moving in that direction, and like what role can we play in sort of moving, whether it's our organizations, our families, as well as our own individual learning. So that's just one. I think it's just, the more I sit with this event, like the more I think like we have to, and whether we argue the anti-racisters or something, but it's not the like the where I'm not racist, as opposed to like actively working against this system feels incredibly important.
So we, talked about racism, and again, racism requires not just prejudice with power. So we need to ask ourselves, who do we have power over? Who do we have agency over? And then where are we sharing? Collusion is silence. So when you are silent, when you see something, you don't say anything, you are being complicit and you are colluding with the system. It should not be the responsibility of people of color to call BS on something that's happening or inequity. And I, again, have been in many rooms where I'm like, my good white colleague, someone's going to say something, and then no one says anything. And then I feel compelled to say it. And then when I leave the room, people will say, oh, I agreed with you. And I'm very clear. If I was on a boat and had a big hole in it, I would not want you in it with me. You have to stand up when it's happening. So we've talked a little about allyship, and allyship really is this notion of you're doing your work. You do not call yourself an ally. People in the community call you an ally. Ally means that you are taking the time to do the work, to learn, and to really dig in. But it's all about you. That's what allyship is, that I'm going to get the information I need. And the internet's fascinating. Wikipedia, if you want to look at some more research based, check out Google Scholar. But it is important when we think about an ally that you don't call yourself an ally. You let others call you that. An accomplice is someone who, when you're in a group or in a meeting, they see something, they say something. A co-conspirator works with your community, works with disenfranchised and disinherited groups as an equal, and how the work sort of shows up and plays out. The next one. As I mentioned earlier, that the work that we do really seeks to move toward belonging, where people have a full potential as both an individual, and that innovation can thrive and views and beliefs and values are integrated. And as you're doing this work, understand there'll be moments that you might want to clutch your pearls. Was in a meeting 2 weeks ago with 2 Black males and a white female, and I made the statement that, oh yeah, we all look alike. And my colleague clutched her pearls like, I can't believe I just said that. And then one of the Black gentlemen said, that's funny you say it. I was on a panel last week and I kept being called the other Black guy's name. And I didn't respond because I wasn't the other Black guy. And that stuff is powerful. It is extremely powerful, because just like white folks, we don't, we're not chocolate milk. You don't shake us up and pour us out and we're all the same. That, we also have our own ranges around humanity. Next one, Keith.
And I just wanted to
Go ahead, Keith. Sorry.
Just from the chat there, that Caitlin had said, like working at an organization that's comfortable talking about this, and it, that is part of this, right? Is the ability to create opportunities for dialogue, for like when something happens, to be able to, when you see something, to say something and process it. It doesn't mean that that's the entirety of it, right? There still is that evolution as organizations, but you know, some of this, right, is starting to create a culture around how are we able to have those conversations. Some of it's training, like some of it's our own personal work that we do. Some of it's just putting things like onto board meeting agendas, staff meeting agendas, sharing some things like, you know, it doesn't always have to be so formalized as like we're launching an equity and inclusion initiative. Like these should be subtle acts of inclusion, like where you're starting to model how to have some of these difficult conversations, as Yvette was alluding to. Over to this next one.
This one I happen to love. If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. I'm going to go to the next, go to Keith. Thanks. So there are 4 types of barriers that we deal with in our organizations and also in our lives. One is sort of that personal part. And what you heard with Tim Scott was that it was almost as if there were 2 different people standing in the room. And that again, this stuff is embedded. So it's our attitude toward ourselves, our attitude toward others. We then have actual behaviors. So what are the slights? For anyone who doesn't know, please don't touch Black women's hair. I have to say this every training. I know it sounds crazy, but it's not. You would be amazed how often people will walk up to us and go, but I think it's pretty, or I want to touch it. Slavery's over. Don't touch me unless you have permission. And quite honestly, don't ask me either, unless we have a relationship and we are intimates. Also institutionalized that, you know, how do we do recruitment and hiring? How do we advance people? Do people actually have not just mentors, but sponsors that will help them to move in organizations? We're seeing more organizations now that are taking on dual CEO roles so that there's more than one voice that's sort of leading that organization. And then, you know, structurally, you know, what are the industry practices? As Keith mentioned earlier with color of law, you know, what does redlining do? You know, what happens when we gerrymander in our community? And also, are we encouraging the people that we provide services to also vote? I'm always fascinating. It's like, you know, my first job at 23 was at a Planned Parenthood, and we actually had voter registration that just happened to sit right when people came into the organization. We didn't tell you who to vote for, we didn't do any of that, because that's outside of our 501c3. But we let people know that voting is something that we would be more than happy to give them the application if they needed it. You gonna do the next one, Keith? Well, actually, I'll do this one and you can do the last one. So this just talks about some of the systemic barriers and some solutions to sort of address that. And I'm going to have Keith go on to the will work.
And then I don't know if we see some videos. So if you've got your video on, have you seen this framework before? So I just find these kinds of things are incredibly helpful that speak to developmental stages for organizations or for people. And so this is equity in the center, and there's a lot of work to do. I would just encourage all of us to, I don't know, just carve out some time coming out of this, if you don't already, to read some of these things, or if you're familiar with it, how can you now share this with your colleagues? So with your organizations or with your board. So this is equity in the center, and they've got great trainings, by the way. So there's lots of, like, we cannot claim that there are not learning opportunities. Like, you used to have to go, you know, and it would be like 2.5 days with Undoing Racism and the People's Institute, and that would be in person. And now there's a whole host of online things where we can now participate together as a board, as a staff. So Equity in the Center does these. There's this cycle of awake to woke to working, which is just like a great shorthand. And it's okay if, like, you're like, well, we're not really even awake as an organization. We've not really begun to talk about the impacts or the intersections of race. You know, and then you get to woke, where organizations are evolving their culture and valuing all people's contributions, or working, you know, which I think increasingly I'm of the opinion that we all need to be working as organizations. Like, it used to be like, oh, well, there's some social justice organizations that will naturally be working, and then some of us won't necessarily based on our mission be working. And now I'm like, yeah, we all need to be working, like in finding some ways. And what I like is the levers around it is just figuring out like, where do senior leaders play a role in your organization? Where does data play a role? I think that was Linda's superpower, was around the usage of data in the early going. But yeah, so part of it is like, what kind of data can you collect? Your organizational culture, your learning environment, the board. And I want to really just stress, like, not to leave the board behind or out of these conversations. Like, they are ultimately going to be really important stakeholders, and you know, sort of like success, when you think about succession planning and the long-term direction and trajectory of an organization, like, you need the board there as well. And that may mean that, you know, you're going to need to spend some time engaging board in this conversation, bringing people on. You may not be able to go as quickly as an organization because you need to bring the board along, and that's okay. Like, we're not sprinting off towards, like, you know, mission accomplished, we've now undone racism as an organization. Like, we are sort of thinking long-term about the engagement, you know, but that's, you know, in addition to the manager's role and kind of the community's role in this. So it's a very, I would hope, a fairly self-explanatory model. There's some really good examples in it, which I think sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And so we wonder, like, well, what does being a woke organization look like? Or what does being a working organization look like? And that comes through talking with one another. Like, there is not a manual that exists in the world that says this is the one way to do this. Like, this is work that accommodates multiple truths, that, like, we have to rethink power dynamics. Like, the other part, there's an article that comes out of the People's Institute around the characteristics of white supremacist culture. And that's jarring for some. I think Yvette and I talk about this, like, are we going to die? Like, are we going to make an issue out of, you know, calling it white supremacist culture or white dominant culture? But just think about, like, how much better our lives would be without those white supremacist traits. Like, when, you know, whether it's the power of the written word, it's power hoarding, it's the idea that there's only one truth, or there's only one right way to do things. So I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with some of those things, like, just to start to, like, make that a part of not just your own learning, but your organization's learning. And I feel like Equity in the Center has done a really nice job. You know, Linda and Debbie and the team can likely point out others. But there's some that we just feel are just great background reading to help get onto the same page as organizations.
Thanks. So here are some things that we think can be helpful as you go back to your offices, is really sort of asking, what is the impact on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, both for you, your board, your team, and your organization? Next one, Keith.
Mm-hmm.
And what gears are missing or may need or maybe a bit squeaky? And this is where we feel very strongly 360-degree evaluation can be very helpful. Evaluation gives us information on sort of where we might want to go, and that you're not just listening to folks inside. And I also would encourage you to do things that are anonymous. I know that for a number of our clients, we actually, as consultants, will do the evaluation, so people do know that it can be candid, because I may not feel comfortable being candid depending on where that information is going. And will this negatively impact my job? Will this negatively, and the number of stories that I've heard across the state of people of color being dinged on their performance appraisal when they sort of say that wasn't cool, or they address the elephant in the room, makes you not want to speak, and it makes you hide, and people just say, okay, I'm going to get my paycheck and that's what I'm going to do. Our next one. This just gives you an idea of how we see the work, and how do you build diversity, equity, inclusion, both the foundations that are necessary and the ability to grow. So again, that idea of, who's initiating it, where's it coming from? Again, needing to be able to do assessment and analysis, and then the strategic plan, ideally strategic plans should be done with the DEI lens. So we strongly encourage that if you're bringing consultants in to do your strategic planning, that you ensure they also have the capacity to integrate your diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging work, because if it's set outside of your strategic plan, and more than likely it will stay outside of your strategic plan. And then what does sustainability look like? And I think we've learned this year that we can do a pivot. We all did a really hard pivot and we did a pretty good job of it. So what does that pivot look like for you? Next one, Keith. So here's just some suggestions for moving from a non-racist to anti-racist organization. Data, making sure that you have defined the terms and that you may have multiple definitions of the same term, but you need to make sure people are on a similar page. Being intentional about your hiring practices. I know for some organizations, they actually put their philosophy of equity and belonging on job descriptions, so that if you're applying for a job description, you know that this is part of our value proposition. And if it's not part of yours, probably please don't apply. I'm making sure that you have people of color in positions of power and that they're not, because I know another challenge for organizations, everyone's hiring a DEI administrator or coordinator. What you're really doing is bastardizing the position. Because ultimately, if I have some person, oh, that's who I go to for everything. And the goal is that this work is built within the entire organization. Have outsiders holding you accountable. You know, are you really doing the things you say you're doing? For white folks, avoid your own using your valid experience with oppression and stay focused on what are the needs of people who've been historically disenfranchised, and understanding that for people who've been historically disenfranchised, acknowledge the resilience. I mean, imagine what people navigate through every day, and put some acknowledgement to that. Recognize your limitations. And for someone asked about BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. What I would say is if you're doing this in your organization, you need to name the people you're working with. If you are working with Asian Pacific Islanders, then say, you know, that's who we're working with. Working with Southeast Asian, I'm working with Vietnamese. If I'm working with African Americans versus someone who may have come from one of the African countries. You know, we do a lot of work in Mexico, and it's always funny. People are like, well, they're Mexicans. Like, no, they're Oaxacans, which is a state in Mexico. That's that part about educating yourself and educating yourself about who you do the work with. And then you have to recognize that you need to rest. All of us need to rest, and that's okay. Great. Had some feedback from some who find the term BIPOC dehumanizing. Absolutely. And again, part of it is that shorthand. We've got to be really mindful if we're doing the work that sometimes the shorthand can be the problem. Keith, we're not going to get to the next. We're over time, so again, you'll have this in the deck, but it just gives you some ideas around power, privilege, and your position. The next slide is for the Center for Nonprofit. Actually has a diversity report that is made available to you. Keith, you want to just go down to the resources and we can come back to Q&A if people can stay?
Yeah, so we're going to share these slides around, and I want to shout out to Yvette, who has pulled together these really beautiful, like just featuring the cover art around historical context resources. Then there's understanding white body privilege, mental health resources, the economics of white supremacy. So like this is, as you see it, there's, dozens and dozens of books like this. Like, so if anyone's thinking like, oh, like we've managed to, cover a lot of ground today in an hour and a half, there's a lot of work to be done. This gives you some sense, but very simple. Like we could start a book club as an organization, read one of these things. Again, start where you are, use what you've got, do what you can. Like books are readily available. There's discussion guides that you could find online. Maybe find one of these texts that is most germane to the work of your organization. Or maybe it's around organizational culture. So I'll back it up, but we'll share these in the slides and just, and encourage all of us, right? Just start somewhere, but stick with it. Like whether it's like, don't just do like a one and done training program, but sort of figure out how does it become part of your organizational DNA over the long term. So
yes, Caitlin, we're going to let you close out, and then Keith and I will hang around for Q&A.
is open now for input, for information. So this was a report that we put out for free in 2019. However, the companion report that comes with it that actually talks about the details of salaries and benefits and how much organizations are contributing towards their employees' health insurance and how much they're paying their executive director or their administrative assistant or things like that. That comes with a comparison report, and we are collecting that information now. So it's really in depth. But we were asking everybody to participate as much as they can, and you will get a free copy of both reports. Ultimately, the compensation report is a $350 value. You will get it for free for participating, even if you don't have any staff and just have board members. We want to know how you think about diversity and governance and things like that with your board as well. I very much encourage you to check that out. We will include the link, obviously, with the follow-up information. It is available. You can get there very easily from njnonprofits.org. So I would ask everybody to participate there. Another way that people can continue this conversation is continuing to talk to Yvette, our wonderful Yvette, who has offered a discount on her services. And Yvette, you want to talk about that real quick? Make sure I got those prices right.
Yep, you got them right. That we have to be, again, supporting the Support Center and Center for Nonprofits and Volunteer Connect. We are offering a 90-minute DEI workshop. If you want to, for your staff or your board or whomever, if you are a member of the Center for it's a $750 value. If you're a member of the Center for Nonprofits, it is a 25% discount. And if you are not a member of the Center for Nonprofits, just for attending this event, there's a 5% discount. So, we'd love to help you in navigating the work.
Absolutely, thank you. And we're just gonna, you can see there are other slides, but we're just gonna keep it that way since I'm having trouble driving. So thank you very much, Yvette, for that generous offer. And we understand that a lot of this requires that in-depth, personalized, because we're all at different stages and it depends on the size of your organization and things like that. All of us do have additional trainings and discussions, and the center's here to continue some of those discussions. If you have specific questions, we can point you in certain directions, but the Support Center, obviously, Yvette's group and Nonprofit Connect as well, so check them out. We can have we do have member Mondays if you're a member of the center every other Monday, and this is a place where it's a similar to today's session, is that it is a smaller group, not recorded, relatively casual place that we can speak freely and ask questions. And things have come up a lot about COVID, but also about how we can all do a better job with DEI and other topics as well. So if you're a member, those are free, and we do encourage everyone to join. You can join today and get a 10% discount if you utilize the member code Jug Handle. So we can do that, and we encourage everyone to stay in touch with us, and just have a big thank you for participating in today. We know it was a lot of information, so thanks for hanging in. Okay, that's all for me.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.